There's a difference between being in charge and being respected. And when you confuse the two, you might still be captain, but you won't be for long.
I'm taking command of this ship. Mr. Fryer, I'll have the keys to the arms chest.
You'll give him nothing!
One more order, Mr. Bligh, and I'll have your head on this deck. By heaven, I swear it!
All right, so going into this one, I had a very specific expectation because everything you hear about this movie is how much of a disaster it was behind the scenes. And usually when that's the case, you can feel it on the screen. But here's the interesting thing. This is one of those rare movies where the fact that a lot of it actually works makes it kind of more impressive. With that in mind, welcome back to The Rank. I'm John, and just a quick heads up on format. I'll hit a handful of behind the scenes facts called the Potent Notables. Then I'll do a movie overview with spoilers, and I'll finish by ranking the movie across 10 categories. And today I'll be continuing to rank the 1962 Best Picture nominees, with Mutiny on the Bounty starring Marlon Brando, Trevor Howard, and Richard Harris, adapted from the novel by Charles Nordhoff and James Norman Hall, with a screenplay written by Charles Lederer and directed by Louis Milestone. Mutiny on the Bounty was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, winning none. But let's see how this one ranks against the other 1962 nominees and against all Best Picture nominees that we've ranked so far, starting with the Potent Notables.
Potent Notables.
As always, we start the Potent Notables with the box office info. Mutiny on the Bounty made $13.7 million against a staggering, at the time, budget of $19 million, which made it a pretty significant flop. And honestly, when you hear what went wrong during the production, that outcome starts to make a lot more sense. This movie was an absolute mess behind the scenes. The original director, Carol Reed, clashed with both Marlon Brando and MGM executives early on. Reed and Brando disagreed on how to portray Captain Bligh and Fletcher Christian, and Reed also had issues with the script itself. And when he tried to make changes, the studio forced him to stick to the original script. At one point, Reed even tried to get Brando fired for holding up production. And when that didn't work, he asked to leave the production, but MGM refused, only to end up firing him later anyway, which actually worked out for Reed because instead of leaving unpaid, he walked away with $200,000. And that kind of dysfunction carried through the entire shoot, largely centered around Brando. And this film is infamous for Marlon Brando's on-set behavior. By this point in his career, he had so much influence that MGM was essentially greenlighting whatever he wanted. At one point, he pulled crew members off the film to help decorate a friend's wedding in Tahiti. And another time, he had planes flown in filled with champagne, turkeys, and hams for parties. He also frequently improvised his lines, sometimes making it impossible for his co-stars to respond, and even went as far as putting cotton in his ears so he wouldn't have to hear their dialogue. And unsurprisingly, it didn't exactly make him popular with the rest of the cast. He was often late, changed his performance after rehearsals, and generally just alienated the British actors. The tension between Brando and Richard Harris was especially intense. In one scene where Christian strikes Mills, multiple takes went poorly. Harris mocked the weak hits, escalated things with some very sarcastic responses, and eventually kissed Brando on the cheek mid-scene, which did not go over well. Brando stormed off set. In another moment, after several takes, Brando just completely walked away, muttering that he didn't know if the scene would work. Harris, understandably frustrated, yelled back, "Act! Who the hell do you think you are?" The irony here is that Harris had actually taken a smaller role just to work with Brando. But by the end, he described the production as nightmarish and a total disaster. And he even refused to attend the premiere. And the premiere itself didn't go much better. At the New York City premiere, Brando was widely booed and jeered, particularly for his English accent, while Trevor Howard received thunderous applause. Brando ended up walking out of the theater mid-screening, and the fallout from this film actually had a real impact on Brando's career. He was seen as the scapegoat for the production's issues, and his reputation took a hit. His box office appeal began to wane as studios became wary of working with him. Even the replacement director, Louis Milestone, wasn't immune to the chaos. This ended up being his final film, and he later estimated that Brando's behavior alone cost the production around $6 million. But it wasn't all disaster. There were a few notable real-world elements tied to the film as well. The ship used in the movie was actually built to the plans of the HMS Bounty, making this the first time that a ship was actually reconstructed this way just for a film. However, during filming, the ship became dangerously heavy due to all the film equipment on board. And decades later in 2012, that same ship sank during Hurricane Sandy, and tragically 2 crew members died. And finally, on a more personal note, the film did have a lasting impact on Brando's life. He met Tarita during filming, and she would go on to become his 3rd wife. Interestingly though, he was still married to his 2nd wife, Movita, who also appeared in this film. So, this doesn't make Marlon Brando sound that great, but those are the potent notables. Let's go on to the movie overview. So I did the potent notables before I watched the movie this time, and I gotta say, I was thinking that I was gonna be watching kind of a mess. And maybe that was a benefit for me, because knowing everything that was going on behind the scenes made me kind of appreciate how well it ended up coming out. Now, it's gonna lay out the plot in the beginning for this. There's a ship named the Bounty, and its mission is to go to Tahiti with a botanist and collect a bunch of plants called breadfruits. Apparently, there are scientists in England that think the breadfruit in Tahiti has the capability of providing food to the world, essentially. They basically think it's an untapped source of calorically dense material. Naturally, that means they want to test their theory on the slaves of Jamaica. They want to do that first and just, see how it goes. And then if it goes well, then they'll give it to white people. Specifically their military, and then of course the citizenry at large. Now the captain of the Bounty is Lieutenant Bligh, who is getting his first captaincy of a ship. We're gonna meet some of his crew and his officers, the most important of which being Fletcher Christian, played as a fop by Marlon Brando. But fop or not, he's gonna end up endearing himself to the crew, something the captain will not. It starts out though with excitement. Everyone is ready for a long voyage to Tahiti. The production built the ship, and the movie likes to relish in looking at it, and it's a sight to behold. I really enjoyed seeing the way they got the boat ready to sail, or the ship. They wouldn't like me calling it a boat. There's so much work that goes into it. It's kind of amazing what humans are capable of and how much convenience we've made for ourselves in a relatively short amount of time. But this beautiful cinematography of a ship going to sea is going to be quickly juxtaposed against a backdrop of a captain who seems to have some disdain for the type of person that makes up his crew, or at least the type of person he views as making up his crew. Now, when the captain boarded the ship, he asked Mills, one of the crew members, to give him some cheese, which is exactly what Mills did. Then one of the other crew members who saw him take some cheese but didn't have the context goes to the first mate, Fletcher Christian, and tattles. Now, I'm of 2 minds here. 1, this guy is a weenie for doing that. But 2 is what comes next. Mills is going to say that the captain asked him to do that. So if anyone is a thief, it's the captain. And unfortunately for Mills, the captain overhears that portion of it. Now, you'd think the captain would say, Mills was right, I asked for it, it's not a big deal. But instead, he gets all butthurt about being called a thief and orders Mills to be whipped 24 times. So back to my second thought here. Number 2, Captain Bligh is a freaking prick. And the next 2 hours of the movie are pretty much all about how much of a prick Bligh really is. And that makes it sound like it's just a dull experience that could have been cut down. And it may have been able to be cut down, but I felt like it was a good slow build. We get his ethos, which is leading through fear, but also he's very much a company man. He sees the goal of the mission as surpassing any and all concerns of the crew, and we see him choosing that time and time again. Like instead of taking the longer route through the Cape of Good Hope, he chooses to weather Cape Horn and put his entire crew at risk. And when Christian, while going through that cape, helps the crew to tie up some barrels that had come loose down below deck, Bligh is going to wake up to the feeling of less movement and immediately order the ship put back. And this results in a man dying under a barrel. And then Bligh shows no remorse whatsoever. He's just a vain elitist who looks down on anyone under his command. And that's how the trip goes, with him doing shit like that on their way to Tahiti. And when they finally get to Tahiti, it's a paradise. I mean, the men on the crew could not have landed in a better place. Apparently, the natives view lovemaking as a gesture of goodwill. And the joke is that the ship's crew's goodwill knows no bounds. Even so, Bligh does not partake in this goodwill, saying that command allows no intimacy. And the only thing that comes close is when the king of the island forces him to dance with his daughter, and we see his vanity in it as he does so. He looks at his men as he's dancing with her and sees them laughing and just starts seething, like a visceral anger from embarrassment on his face. And as the audience, you see that happening, and you start to feel anxious for the crew, like what is he gonna do to punish them for this? But this is also the beginning of the weird and poorly acted love story between Fletcher Christian and the king's daughter. I mean, we're really meant to care about this, but I just didn't. So So he kind of falls in love, but it's more her and she wants him to stay, but he knows he has to go because England's his home. I think it's meant to be like a star-crossed lovers thing, and instead, and mostly because of her acting, it just feels like a bad play that they're reading. But Fletcher isn't the only one to have some love. The midshipman, Ned, he's gonna fall in love and he wants to marry his lady. So he goes to the captain and asks him, "Can you marry us?" And the captain just laughs at him. Then, on top of the derisive laughter, he tells Ned to, quote, "Get that slut off my ship." It's really gross and it continues to show what kind of character he has. But what I find really interesting about this moment is that this seems to be the straw that broke the camel's back, for Mills especially and some of the other crew. And Mills tends to be the ringleader. So it wasn't the lashings or the barbaric torture he inflicts on them. It was the calling the kid's girlfriend a slut. But they're not the only ones that are sick of him. Fletcher is clearly getting to a tipping point as well. But that tipping point takes a lot longer than you'd expect. So the men try to desert, but it doesn't work. So Bligh, as you would expect, punishes them harshly. But in this moment, Fletcher speaks aloud in front of everyone, and to the captain says, "I've never met an officer who inflicts punishment with such relish. It makes me sick." And that statement is going to give Mills hope that Fletcher is going to take Bligh out. Amazingly though, he keeps obeying Bligh's commands. Now at this point, they've collected all the breadfruit they need, they're on their way back to England, and even when Captain Bligh starts rationing the water from the men so that he can save every single drop he needs for the breadfruit plant, he continues to obey Bligh's commands. And the thing is, though, is that the captain ordered them to take more breadfruit plant than they needed, as if having more would make up for the fact that they were behind on time. And even though the botanist said that losing some is inevitable and basically not a big deal, but Bligh determines that the plants need the water more than his men. Even that doesn't convince Fletcher to mutiny. Men start to die because of this. And still Fletcher doesn't mutiny. Now the buildup was high and I was desperate to see this mutiny. I mean, fuck Bligh. Dude needs to go. But when it finally happens, it's because Fletcher is giving a man fresh water because he's gone mad from drinking seawater. And this, of course, is against the captain's orders. And when Bligh sees it, he goes into a rage and then he kicks Fletcher's arm to stop him from ladling water into this guy's mouth. Fletcher then turns and smacks Bligh in the face, knocking him to the ground, which was a moment of catharsis for sure. But of course, Bligh relishes this because now he's got the chance he can finally arrest Fletcher, who he has despised this whole trip. And it's only when presented with his own arrest that Fletcher finally mutinies. So I found that a little disappointing. It's honest, but it's not as cathartic because it doesn't feel as altruistic. But he doesn't let his fellow mutineers kill Bligh, and then they send Bligh and a bunch of other people away on a dinghy. And I was actually surprised by how many didn't want to join the mutiny. But kudos to the filmmakers for making it clear how ruined they all had become by taking part in this. The movie wants us to think that especially Fletcher gave up a lot, but they all have given up their lives essentially. So what more can someone lose? I don't see how Fletcher lost more. And this is where things get sort of weird. There's still an hour left of this movie. The mutiny happened, what else is there? Well, the mutineers go back to Tahiti. They find their women and then they recruit some more Tahitians to come on board and help them sail to try to find a new island for them to live on. And they find Pitcairn Island, and it's completely by accident, and they realize that it's charted wrong. Now the benefit here is that because it's charted wrong, the only way the British Navy would find them is by accident. Now in addition to this, Bligh does end up getting back to a British port and has a hearing on the loss of the bounty. And amazingly, he gets acquitted, which is super annoying. Now the movie is going to give us a bit of catharsis when the committee extending the acquittal rebukes him by saying that they always try to elevate gentlemen to the roles of captain. And in this case, the appointment was a failure. And it's a nice moment, but that's all that happens to him. They just say he's not a gentleman. I mean, who gives a shit? And while he has the dishonor of not being called a gentleman anymore, Fletcher is depressed at having lost his foppish life at sea. He's so distressed about it that he wants to go back to London and plead their case. He thinks they'll win, but Mills and the crew, they don't. They're going to take drastic measures and they're going to torch the ship, which will culminate in Fletcher's death. What's fascinating about this is that they give an interesting view into the psychology of trauma. When Fletcher asks the men, why did they do that? They had nothing to fear from him. And when they respond by saying that they were afraid that Fletcher was going to force them to go, Fletcher absolves them. And he says to them, we've all been affected by Bligh's behavior. in different ways. I mean, that is a solid ending. However, they decide to end with the bad actress crying over Fletcher's body, and then a scene of the burning ship, which had run aground on a reef, by the way, suddenly just quickly sink into the sea. Now, if it had run aground, how could it have sunk fully into the water? I get the imagery. You know, it's more of a metaphor. It's not meant to be taken literally, but I just still think it was a bad way to end it. Anyway, that's the whole movie. Let's see how it ranked.
A rank.
So the rank is where I rank the movie based on 10 categories: story, acting, originality, film coherence, cinematography, score/soundtrack/sound, script structure and dialogue, character relatability, production value, and my rank. I rank it on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best. And before I dive into the rankings, I just want to say if you're enjoying this episode, please leave a like down below. It really does help me out. But without further ado, the first category is story. I really liked this story. I tend to enjoy stories that take place in historical times, so it has that going for it for me. But I thought this was a great story besides that. And I like that they didn't just climax with the mutiny, but showed the loss that the mutiny entails and the privilege of the officer class that Bligh would just get away with. I gave it a 9. The next category is acting. So going into this, I thought I was going to think Brando's accent was laughable. However, and maybe this is because I'm a Yank, I thought it was fine. I didn't have any issue with it, and he never dropped it. It was consistent throughout the movie. I thought he was excellent in it, actually. I thought pretty much everyone was excellent in it, with a few exceptions. Now, one was the crew member that was missing a finger. He was pretty hammy at times. Not egregious, but definitely wasn't in the same league as the others. And then there was the king's daughter. She was just so freaking bad. Do I understand why Marlon Brando ended up marrying her? Yeah. Does that make her a good actor? Very much no. So I gave it an 8.25 because the rest was very strong. That brings us to originality. Well, it's a remake, so there are some points against it there. I did think it was cool that they built the ship for the movie, and I decided to look up the differences between the two films, the one that came out in 1935 and the one that came out in 1962. And because this movie had a very different ending than the 1935 version, and that ending was seemingly more internal and thoughtful, I'm going to give it some points. So I gave it a 7. That brings us to film coherence. And the big knock on this movie is that it's too long. It also felt like I was watching Sayonara again, kind of, because of the love story, except that Sayonara was all about the love story, and this one wanted you to believe in a subplot one. I think they could have removed that from the movie and it would have actually been better. Anyway, they ended at the wrong point. The ending should have been when he forgave his crew because he understood their trauma. The only other issue I had with it is that it had this voiceover narration that we just didn't need. Still though, I thought it was a strong movie, just a little too long. I gave it a 7.5. So that brings us to cinematography. And there's no denying that the cinematography in this one is beautiful. They spent a lot of time and care in this category, and you can tell. I believe that was probably why it was too long. How do you cut such beautiful takes? I gave it a 10. On to score/soundtrack/sound. And this score falls into the same trap that a lot of older movies fall into, in that it tends to over-dramatize the moment. I did enjoy the score nonetheless, though. I gave it an 8. That brings us to script structure and dialogue. It was clearly trying to present the psychological effects of trauma. I like the fact that it wasn't just a defeat the villain and everything's all better now script. However, they did overwrite it in parts because they were really trying to hammer that point home instead of just letting us feel it. Still though, that wasn't really egregious. Obviously, there's some structure issues because of the whole love story subplot thing, but I still thought it was excellent. I gave it an 8.5. So that brings us to character relatability. And this is a very relatable film. Even Captain Bligh is relatable in his insatiable desire to complete the mission and prove himself capable. Fletcher's hesitation feels maddening up until the mutiny, but when you see the aftermath, you understand why he took so long. It was all well done. I gave it a 9.5. So that brings us to production value. And I don't know how you don't give this production value a 10. They went all out on this and it shows. Beautiful scenery, an amazing ship. For a 1962 movie to really make me feel that they were actually out at sea is pretty impressive. I gave it a 10. That brings us to the last category, which is my rank. I was really expecting to not like this movie as much as I did. I read that Marlon caused tons of problems on set, that his accent was laughable. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I really liked his accent. Now, I've stated my case on the things that I didn't like about it, but I was engaged, entertained, and interested throughout the 3 hours of the movie. I gave it an 8.75. So altogether, that puts Mutiny on the Bounty at an 86.5, which makes it a supreme cinema. This actually puts it ahead of all the other 1962 nominees, with one left to rank. It's ahead of The Longest Day, which is in second place, by a surprising 2.75 points. As far as all time, this ties Mutiny on the Bounty with The Big Short of all pictures, just below The Revenant by 0.1 points, and just above Sideways by 0.15. And if you're ranking along with me, drop your score for this one in the comments. Thanks for listening and or watching. Check out my other Best Picture ranking episodes or any of my other movie or sitcom ranking episodes on this channel. Remember to subscribe, comment, and like. For up-to-date rankings, check out my website, therankpodcast.com, where you can also email me at info or john@therankpodcast.com. And if you really want to support the show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/therankpodcast, which is newly revamped. But all right, it's time to end. I don't want to keep going. I don't want to go overboard. And he tells them they've
Cut!
And he says to them, we've all been affected by
Cut!
And he says to them that they've all
That's okay. Take your time.